I've suggested a fourfold paradigm. Rather than going through and reading this point by point, I'll just emphasize, as I said previously, that the key litmus test, I think, in categorizing the warfare is the role of the Lord himself, whether he's active or passive, and the role of the people. And so within 2 and 3, we have what is often apparently sometimes a less active role of Yahweh or a passive permissive role of Yahweh. But in 1 and 4, the Lord is active either for Israel or against Israel. And so this is at least a suggested rubric for understanding it. I don't know if it solves every question, but it at least is a framework that I haven't seen elsewhere, and so I tried to put this together. All right, so moving beyond this fourfold classification, I want to just look at how traditional Yahweh war, that is to say warfare after the paradigmatic Exodus event in the Old Testament, typically takes place. And I want to begin by looking at a passage of Scripture that I think is one of the classic expressions of this sort of warfare. And it's in 2 Chronicles 20. If you read through the Chronicles narrative, the chronicler's narrative of the history of Israel, there's often an emphasis on the Davidic king being delivered dramatically from his enemies. And we talk about the synoptic problem sometimes, the so-called synoptic problem in New Testament studies, but there are also synoptic issues related to how Chronicles relates to the history of Israel vis-a-vis how Kings does, right? Well, here in 2 Chronicles 20, we have this story of Jehoshaphat being delivered from his enemies. And I just wanted to read through this to frame how this often took place. It begins this: after this, the Moabites and Ammonites, and with them, some of the Mennonites, came against Jehoshaphat for battle. Some men came and told Jehoshaphat, "A great multitude is coming against you from Edom and from beyond the sea, and behold, they are in Hadazon Tamar," that is En-gedi. Then Jehoshaphat was afraid and set his face to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. And Judah assembled to seek help from the Lord. From all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord. And Jehoshaphat stood in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem in the house of the Lord before the new court and said, "O Lord God of our fathers, are you not God in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. In your hand are power and might, so that none is able to withstand you. Did you not, our God, drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? And they have lived in it and have built for you in it a sanctuary for your name, saying, if disaster comes upon us, the sword, judgment, or pestilence, or famine, we will stand before this house and before you, for your name is in this house, and cry out to you in our affliction, and you will hear and save. And now behold, the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came from the land of Egypt, and whom they avoided and did not destroy, behold, they reward us by coming to drive us out of your possession, which you gave us to inherit." Let me just mention here, if you remember the pattern that I've already proposed, we see a lot of these elements here, right, of crying out in peril and of connecting this Yahweh war to the land that God had given them. Verse 12, "O our God, will you not execute judgment on them? For we are powerless against this great horde that is coming against us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." Notice what happens next. "Meanwhile, all Judah stood before the Lord with their little ones, their wives, and their children. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jahaziel, the son of Zechariah, son of Benaiah, son of Jael, son of Mattaniah, a Levite of the sons of Asaph, in the midst of the assembly," taking a prophetic role here. "And he said, Listen, all Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem and King Jehoshaphat. Thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid and do not be dismayed at this great horde, for the battle is not yours but God's. Tomorrow go down against them. Behold, they will come up by the ascent of Ziz. You will find them at the end of the valley, east of the wilderness of Jeruel. You will not need to fight in this battle. Stand firm, hold your position, and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf, O Judah and Jerusalem. Do not be afraid, do not be dismayed. Tomorrow go out against them, and the Lord will be with you." It goes on to relate how they prayed to the Lord. Verse 20, "They arose early in the morning, went out into the wilderness. When they went out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, Hear me, Judah and inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will be established. Believe his prophets, and you will succeed. And when he had taken counsel with the people, he appointed those who were to sing to the Lord and praise him in holy attire as they went before the army and say, Give thanks to the Lord, for his steadfast love endures forever. And when they began to sing and praise, the Lord set an ambush against the men of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, who had come against Judah, so that they were routed. For the men of Ammon and Moab rose against the inhabitants of Mount Seir, devoting them to destruction. And when they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, they all helped to destroy one another. It goes on to describe the spoils afterwards, and at the end of verse 30, so the realm of Jehoshaphat was quiet, for his God gave him rest all around. So when we look at Yahweh war in the Old Testament, we see that often a pattern develops as to how this is enacted. Now, some have argued that it's not methodologically sound to produce a paradigm as if to say that every Yahweh war fit a certain pattern. Now, of course, we do realize that there were variations from battle to battle, but I think it is helpful to see that when you produce a pattern, it does help us to distinguish variations from that pattern to see what is typical of how the Lord conducts battles on behalf of His people. So often these are the sorts of things that would happen. There'd be a spiritual consecration of the people. Particularly we notice this in the conquest of Canaan as they come into the land. There's a consecration of the people. And sometimes they consult the will of the Lord. Now usually Yahweh takes initiative by raising up a prophet. And I would say this is a more classic form of Yahweh war. But at times they consult Yahweh through the priest. Although I would argue this is a diminution of Yahweh war in the sense that it's moving from pure Yahweh war to a more synergistic framework. If you read the narrative of Saul's life, you'll notice how often the Lord does not answer him, vis-a-vis how the Lord answers David, for example. So you see a distinction there in not being able to find the Lord's will as he's going into battle. There is often intercession or sacrifice. Israel's enemies become hard-hearted and aggressively antagonistic. There's even a phrase in the Old Testament that it was the Lord's will that they become hard-hearted so that He could show His glory and judge them. So they become hard-hearted and antagonistic. This, of course, in the Exodus event shows the pattern, and later is often the case as well. Israel is commanded to be strong and courageous, not to fear or be dismayed. That is, they're to take strength and be confident that the Lord is going to give them the victory. Then Israel's enemies lose courage and begin to panic. We see this in the Jehoshaphat account where they turn on one another. And it becomes really a battle waged where the enemies of the Lord are destroying each other. The announcement of victory is given by Yahweh, often with the formula, enemy X is given into your hand. This is a frequent phrase in the Hebrew Bible suggesting that the Lord has given victory to His people. And then during battle, certain things often happen. The Lord often goes before the people. Sometimes this is symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant, although I think some have wrongly said that the Ark of the Covenant is nearly always there. I don't think that's the case. In fact, if you read 1 Samuel, you'll notice that when the Israelites lose the Ark of the Covenant to the Philistines, it's because they lost the first conflict, and so they bring the Ark of the Covenant to ensure triumph in the next conflict, and that's when disaster ensues. Some have suggested the Ark of the Covenant was viewed as sort of this palladium to ensure them protection and victory. I don't know necessarily that's the case, but it did seem to symbolize the Lord's presence, and so often it would be there, particularly in the conquest of Canaan. The people would often march behind their military leader in procession, often as a religious procession. The Lord intervenes. He induces panic and confusion. A trumpet blast sometimes is sounded, which galvanizes the troops or announces the battle action. I'll just say this by way of reference. It is interesting how often there are trumpets also in the eschatological texts that deal with how the Lord will redeem His people in the eschaton. And I would suggest that perhaps there's a connection here to Yahweh war and what the Lord does. There's occasional application of herem to the enemy. Now, this is important because often there's a failure to distinguish between herem as an entity, which I'll talk about more in a minute, and Yahweh war itself. In fact, this is a methodological error that I see repeatedly in this book in particular, where Yahweh war is unilaterally equated with herem, and I'll make the case that we shouldn't overlap them completely because herem is a distinguishable feature of Yahweh war that is applied to the land. It's not always applied to Israel's enemy. In fact, if you look at the corpus of the Old Testament, we find herem largely in the context of Joshua and then virtually disappearing in the later narratives. Although there are a few occurrences from time to time, but generally speaking, it's in Joshua that we find it. or Deuteronomy, looking forward to taking the land. And then after battle, there's a return march, triumphant, in which God is glorified. The military leader is often exalted. In some cases, for instance, in the book of Joshua, particularly to give Joshua standing in the eyes of the people. This was an important feature of Yahweh War. And then there's a celebration of victory through singing, often led by the women. So we do see interesting patterns here. For instance, in the Exodus event, Exodus 15, Miriam and the women lead. In Judges, we see this in Judges 5. Deborah is involved in this. I think this is part of when Jephthah returns and his daughter runs out to meet him. This is part of the celebration after the victory, and unfortunately he's made a foolish vow that spells demise for his family. So there's a celebration often led by the women. Longman and Reed in their book, God is a Warrior, apply the terminology new song. When you hear a new song, that it's often referring to these victory songs after the celebration of triumph. I haven't studied it out definitively to see if that's the case, but I think perhaps there is a connection there. So they come back and then they dedicate the spoils to God at His sanctuary, or they designate recipients among the people. Now this is an interesting subfeature of harem, because sometimes in what I would call extreme forms of harem, everything is to be dedicated to the Lord. This is why, for instance, Achan and his family come under the judgment of the Lord, because he tries to misappropriate what's been designated for the Lord. But what's interesting is if you read on in Joshua, and I'll get to this in a moment, there are only 3 cities which are burned with fire: Jericho, Ai, and Hatzor in the north. And in Ai and Hatzor, spoils are taken by the people. So it's only Jericho where everything is turned over to the Lord as harem. And so all this to say, I think there is some flexibility in how extreme the form of harem is. So as I read this, how I would interpret this is, when God declares harem against Jericho, He's asserting His lordship over the entire land. And then when He's moving to Ai and Hatzor, He's expressing in a lesser form of harem, hegemony over the central and northern parts of the land. Now that's not airtight, but I think that may be a pattern of what's going on. But there are extreme forms and perhaps lesser forms. But when everything is turned over to God, it's to build His sanctuary and to adorn God's dwelling place, and particularly with Jericho and some other places. This is the thought behind what's going on in Deuteronomy 2 and in Deuteronomy 3. All right, so having looked at that, let me seek now to define Yahweh War, incorporating these various elements. Often when I define things, I recall the words of D.A. Carson. If you know D.A. Carson, a New Testament scholar, he was often asked why his definitions were so long. And he said, well, they may be long, but I think they're right. And that is to say, I think they got everything in there that was necessary. So this is my attempt to do that. So I would define it this way, that Yahweh War is the unique divine initiation of spiritual and physical military conflict tied theologically to Israel's establishment and preservation as the distinctive mediatory theocracy. That's a mouthful. But I go on to say it's waged for several reasons: to sustain God's exclusive holiness and sovereign right to inhabit His land, to bequeath this sacred land of His dwelling in accordance with His character and promises, right? When God ordains Moses as the prophet to lead the people out, what He's really doing is mobilizing covenant provisions. And so this is in keeping with His character and promises. To uphold His compassionate desire to extend blessing and shalom to all peoples of the earth, and to achieve His supreme glorification through salvation and judgment. Okay, that's a lengthy definition, but I think what we need to stress is God takes the initiative. It's tied to Israel as a distinct entity. It's due to God's exclusive transcendent sovereignty, His right to designate the land, His desire to extend compassion and grace and blessing, and to achieve His supreme glorification. So I'm seeking here to have what I would call a theocentric definition of Yahweh War that reflects the character and sovereignty of God. Now there are unique cases such as the conquest of Canaan, or in Yahweh's perpetual conflict with Amalek, for instance in Exodus 17, that there may be the imposition of harem, but I don't include that as a definition of Yahweh War itself. I think that's a subset feature of some aspects of Yahweh War. But Yahweh war itself, I would say, is a larger category that incorporates some of these features that I've suggested. All right, so having looked at all that, we're now going to move into what I would call more of the present implications. And this is where we'll look at Yahweh war in terms of some of the questions that are asked in modern day terms about how do we relate this to either genocide or to other accusations that are often leveled. For instance, the question sometimes is raised, does Yahweh war, particularly in the conquest of Canaan, amount to genocide? As I've said, there are a number of evangelicals that say, yes, in fact, this is genocide. Others demur, but this is a frequent charge that is leveled, particularly by skeptics of the faith. Not only the new atheists that I've mentioned, but there are other authors such as Wes Morriston, who has written several articles in different journals about this. Edwin Curley. There was a book called The Portable Atheist, if you've ever seen that. And there's an essay in there by Elizabeth Anderson entitled, If God is Dead, Is Everything Permitted? And she particularly attacks the monotheistic religions as arbiters of genocide. And so this is a frequent charge that is made. And now let me just say that this is an issue that is complex and probably deserves a lengthier treatment than I can do in the space of these lectures. And anyone who attempts to do this, I have to admit at the outset that I'm not an expert in all of these philosophical fields, particularly when we get to Islam. I am not an expert in Islam, but I have studied the Old Testament and studied Islam enough to see the distinctions that I'll suggest. But there's a lot of material, and it's difficult to master everything, but I think if we're consistent with Scripture, we'll see some patterns that help us to answer some of these questions. Now, when Wes Morriston, who's the skeptic I mentioned, says that in the Bible we find genocide taking place, he uses the Oxford English Dictionary, which defines genocide in a certain way, as his benchmark, his litmus test for what is genocide. So I'll include this definition here. The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the deliberate and systematic extermination of an ethnic or national group. Now, we probably, I think, should add to this what's been supplemented by the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which has in its Article 2 a definition of genocide, and it expands this definition to include racial or religious groups. Okay, so this is the customary definition of genocide. I'm not trying to pull a hat trick here and do some magical manipulation of the definition. I'll use the definition that skeptics themselves use in order to work with this material. So if we're to say that, working from this definition as a baseline, that God mandated, that is to say, the question is, did God command genocide in the Old Testament? I would posit that one must demonstrate at least two premises. And that is, number one, God deliberately targeted the Canaanites, Amalekites, and Amorites, and I'll use them as sort of a broad brush stroke for all the peoples. I think typically the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Amalekites are the brunt of the texts that we would, that skeptics would classify as genocidal texts in the Old Testament, that they were targeted due in principle to ethnic or national identity. That is to say, they are targeted because they are Canaanites, because they are Amalekites, because they are Amorites, as if that's the defining feature for why this is mandated, if that makes sense. Number two, that God ordered the systematic slaughter of these people groups until every single Canaanite, Amalekite, or Amorite had been exterminated. So these are really the two premises that you have to establish, I think, to say there is genocide. Now, some would argue that that is, in fact, what takes place, and I'll argue that I think we can interpret the data a different way. Now, in this book of four views, what I would consider the most radical interpretation is that of C.S. Cowles, who taught for many years at a Nazarene university. And he goes so far in this book to say, Moses was the first in known history to spell out an ideology of holy war, that dictated, unlike Muhammad's reformulation, the genocidal destruction of enemies. Moses and Joshua were the first to engage in campaigns of ethnic cleansing as Hiram, acts of religious devotion. And as I said before, Cowles takes what I would consider an extreme view. He's essentially a Marcionite in wanting to jettison 3/4 of the Bible. But that's another issue I won't get into. But essentially he's saying that Moses is a genocidal leader who's following an ideology of holy war that is genocide. Even Merrill, as I mentioned before, admits this in several places in his essay in this book. More recently, Christianity Today in 2013 had an article written by a pastor named Mark Buchanan, and the title of the article was, "Can We Trust the God of Genocide?" And I'll quote what he says. He wonders whether Christians can trust, quote, "the old covenant God who lays waste to entire cities, lets babies be dashed on the rocks, opens the earth to swallow families whole, smites his own priests for just touching holy relics, and encourages parents to stone their children for acting up." Now, this is supposedly one of our own, I guess, right? This is an evangelical in Christianity Today. So are we supposed to see it this way? Well, moving farther afield, perhaps you heard some of the comments that Christian Bale made, and I'm not endorsing this movie. I haven't even seen it. I don't like to watch movies that pretend to be a presentation of biblical narratives because I can't sit through them often without throwing something at the television. But Christian Bale, he made some comments. He had an interview with ABC, and I have in quotes here the actual words he used. He said, "Moses was schizophrenic. He was barbaric, a troubled and tumultuous man, and a terrorist to the Egyptian empire." He said, "What would happen if Moses arrived today? Drones would be sent out after him, right?" So this was Christian Bale's expert authoritative opinion on Moses from having played Moses in a film. All right, so what do we say about this? There are two authors who wrote a book recently called "Does God Really Command Genocide?" Paul Copan and Matthew Flanagan. And I have some of their arguments here, and I'll augment and supplement in some ways and distinguish some things. But they argue in this book, which I think came out in 2015, that charges of genocide are misguided and false. That is to say, that's really not the right way to describe what's going on. And they give several reasons why this is the case. And I agree with much of their thinking here. First, they say, the command to wipe out the Canaanites was an exceptional or occasional command, that is to say, a non-repeatable command, intended for a particular people at a particular time and place, and therefore is not to be viewed as either condoning or constituting genocide as customarily understood. Of course, what the skeptics don't often admit, at least at the outset, is they're applying anachronistically definitions of the contemporary world to what took place in the ancient world. And really you can't do that without it being fraught with challenges because you're trying to impose your worldview on an ancient context and milieu. Second, they argue that the Bible is clear the Canaanites were guilty of acts of heinous sexual perversion and murder, including incest, which I think probably even pertains to child molestation, adultery, bestiality, ritual prostitution, and infanticide, which are criminal acts that would still not be tolerated in most Western nations today. So this is often missing from skeptics who criticize the purported genocidal text. John Alistair adds, he wrote an essay about the so-called genocide of the Amalekites, and he says, he argues that they were notorious for killing children. And this is probably the case when Samuel comes and Saul's been disobedient in conducting genocide on the Amalekites. He says to Agag that as you've made other mothers childless, I will make your mother childless. The intent there being that the Amalekites likely targeted extermination even of the children. All right, third, these authors suggest a greater number of promises or commands instruct the Israelites to gradually dispossess the Canaanites rather to exterminate them, suggesting that many Canaanites had opportunity to flee the land and perhaps were spared. Now this may in fact be the case, and I do see that there are a number of passages that talk about this gradual displacement. And the thinking is that it would be gradual so that the people of Israel wouldn't be overwhelmed by the wild animals, that there wouldn't be, that the land would fall into disrepair, and so it would be a gradual transition. Now, the tension, and this is an interpretive issue that I don't get into a lot today, but it is something to think through, is how Joshua presents the conquest of Canaan versus how Judges presents what appears to have taken place. That is to say, when we read Judges, we see that there are still Canaanites there, so we have to reconcile that account with the Joshua account and understand what's going on. And so this is an interpretive issue sometimes that leads interpreters in different ways. One of them is, by this next point, they argue that some of the language condoning utter destruction should be viewed hyperbolically, especially since peoples such as the Amalekites continue to survive even centuries after claims were made to have blotted them out. Now, we could take a little more time to look into this in detail, but if you look at 1 Samuel 15, Saul claims to have blotted out the Amalekites, that is, to have devoted them to destruction. Now, it may be that Saul is simply claiming something that he really didn't do, but if we give him the benefit of the doubt and say that in some sense he's representing what took place as close to veracity and truth, it may suggest that when he says he devoted them to destruction, it wasn't that the entire people group was liquidated in every sense of the term. The reason being, for example, there are a few issues related to this. Number one, when Samuel says to Agag, "Your mother will now be childless," that presupposes she's still alive, perhaps in some sense. And then secondarily, we find Amalekites throughout Scripture. For instance, later in David's reign, we have several incidents of Amalekites coming and attacking David. And many would even connect Haman in the book of Esther back to this Amalekite people group because he's called an Agagite there. And so many would connect him back to the Amalekites, and it's perhaps the case that he was part of that people group. Now, I'll also give a caveat and just say this, that I'm not sure that if you say that it's hyperbolic, that completely eliminates the problem, because whether it's one city or all the cities, you still have some tension in these texts, right? That God is commanding what takes place as some sort of attack against the people as a whole. Okay, but this is perhaps one way that some would suggest. Another is that the command to blot out these peoples is predicated largely on the hostile aggression that they initiate toward Yahweh and His people. And I would say this is the case. If you read carefully the narratives in the Old Testament, the Amalekites in particular are the aggressors who come and attack the people of Israel. And in particular, they were picking out the infirmed, the stragglers, the weak, and so they showed hostile aggression towards God's people. And I would just submit that when you do see people groups that are judged through either Haram or in the case with Egypt, they are purporting hostile aggression that threatens the existence of the nation itself. For instance, Egypt, with its mandated policy of killing the firstborn children, if not stopped, would have essentially liquidated the nation of Israel. And so there had to be something done. When God steps in with violence, I would suggest that this is in relation to the fact that because of sin and aggression and hostility towards God's people, there has to be a proportionate amount of violence enacted in order to redeem and rescue God's people, in order to save the nation Israel. So it is the case with the Amorites, for instance, if you read in Deuteronomy where Sihon and Og, those kings are particularly aggressive towards God's people. And so often it's the case that they're initiating aggression toward Yahweh's people. And it's not so much that Yahweh is at war with the Amalekites as the Amalekites are at war with Yahweh. And so Exodus 17 suggests this. And you can look up different references, but Exodus 17, Numbers 14, Judges 3, Judges 6, Esther 3, the Amalekites throughout the centuries opposed Israel and sought to liquidate them. All right, sixth, God in His sovereignty knew these peoples would oppose the Israelites in every generation and thus would seek to thwart God's plan to bless the world. If the nation Israel is destroyed, God's promise to bless all nations through Abraham in Genesis 12 becomes null and void. Therefore, the nation must be protected, and God in His sovereignty knew that these peoples would oppose the Israelites in every generation. Don't we even see this today through anti-Semitism? There still is a feeling latent, I would say, in many cultures that seek to obliterate and destroy the Jewish people. And so this was the case in the ancient context as well. And then really this conflict is a development of the promise to bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. If we read carefully Genesis 12, we'll see it casts a shadow on all of these war narratives to come, that this is really the enactment of God's promise to bless or to curse, depending on how those nations treat Israel. And so often when God declares war on these peoples, it's because they have aggressively sought to wipe out the people. They've waged war against God's people, and so God is stepping in to protect them. An instance where this is interesting is the case of the Kenites. The Kenites are descendants of Moses' father-in-law Jethro. When Saul comes to destroy the Amalekites, and really what he's supposed to be doing is following through on the war that Yahweh declared in Exodus 17, and if he were a faithful king, he'd be fulfilling that, and instead he disobeys. But when Saul comes to the Amalekites, he tells the Kenites, we're about to destroy them, get out. And that's what they do in 1 Samuel 15:6. And likely what's going on is because they've had a friendly posture toward the people of Israel, they're spared. And so often we see this connection between aggression and Yahweh war. Now, having framed some of these distinctions, let me also say that we still have a difficulty, I think, when we read these accounts in Deuteronomy, that Moses does seem to be indicating that they are to wipe out segments of the Canaanite population. So how are we to interpret these texts? Even if we have several good answers, such as these are suggested, I think we still feel this tension, and we would all admit that. And in particular, there are two chapters where this comes to the fore, and that is Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 20. Let me just read some of the texts here from Deuteronomy, and you can process this as we work through it and think about what this means. Moses says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land which you are entering to take possession of it and expels many nations from before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you, and when the Lord your God gives them over to you, you shall strike them and shall certainly consign them to eradication, as I would translate this, or devote them to destruction, put them under the ban. You shall make no covenant with them, and you shall not show kindness to them, or mercy. You shall consume all the peoples that the Lord your God gives to you. Your eye shall not pity them, nor shall you serve their gods, for that would be a snare for you. He will give their kings into your hand, and you shall efface their name, blot it out from under heaven. No one will stand against you until you have wiped them out. Strong language, we would all admit. Now, significant concepts in this passage are a few of the following. For instance, there is to be the imposition of herem, this word that I keep referring to. It's a Hebrew word. It also occurs in Sabaean and Moabite in ancient Near Eastern inscriptions I'll talk about at some point. The imposition of this, or the ban, which I've provisionally translated as consign them to eradication, we find that imposed here in verse 2, for instance. They're said to strike the enemy, verse 2. They are to consume them. This is the Hebrew word for eating up or consuming them. They are to withhold kindness, this word hanan, which often has the idea of showing favor or kindness or grace. And they are to withhold pity, the Hebrew word chus. They are not to show pity in sparing them. They are to efface their name. This is the hefil stem of avad, to make something go through the process of perishing, that is to say, effacing their name, and they are to wipe them out. Merrill himself notes that this command entails the Israelites' delivery of these hopelessly unrepentant idolaters to the harem, that is, to total and unexceptional destruction. The second chapter that outlines some of this is in Deuteronomy 20. And here it's reiterated in similar fashion. In Deuteronomy 20, 16, and 17, Moses says, only in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving to you as an inheritance, you shall not keep alive anything that breathes, but you shall certainly consign them to eradication or devote them to destruction. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, just as the Lord your God commanded you. So what do we find here? Again, we find reference to the imposition of herem. They are to consign them to eradication or devote them to destruction. And additionally, we find here the phraseology not found in Deuteronomy 7, that they are not to keep alive anything that breathes. Literally, the command is, you shall not preserve the life of all breath. And so, in both of these Deuteronomy passages, a vital component of this command to wipe out the Canaanites centers upon the meaning of this term, herem. Now, I would just argue as a brief excursus here that when charges are made that Yahweh war is genocide, this is methodologically erroneous, because really they should be saying herem is genocide, if anything is. That is to say, Yahweh war itself is a larger category. It encompasses 3 out of the 4 categories of warfare, I would argue, in the Old Testament. And in its purest form, it's essentially a defensive measure serving to liberate God's people from bondage or peril. The term herem does not occur, for instance, in the Exodus event. So, for instance, the Israelites are not to impose herem on the Egyptians. With the Egyptians, the majority of those who are judged and destroyed are the enemy combatants at the Red Sea, although also the firstborn sons are. In Hezekiah's deliverance, for instance, from Sennacherib's army, the Assyrian military was decimated rather than the Assyrian population at large. So my argument is simply this, that if we're going to talk about so-called genocide taking place, we have to really focus it on the meaning of this term herem, rather than making a unilateral statement that Yahweh war amounts to genocide. I would see a distinction here, and so that's what I'm arguing for. So what is herem? This is where we need to really define our terms and understand. If you look at the lexicons of Hebrew, you're going to see a fairly consistent attempt to translate this word or gloss it in the following ways. It's been defined as to utterly destroy or exterminate, to banish or devote to the ban. That's sort of an older way of describing it as something that's put under the ban. I'm not sure, to my mind, that doesn't really clearly communicate necessarily what's going on, but the idea of devoting it to that. To consecrate, to place under the ban that which is forbidden, either because it is accursed and should be destroyed or because it is very holy. And I'll point out this fact as we go along, and that is where the confusion and difficulty arises is items at both ends of the spectrum are called herem in different texts of the Old Testament. So we have on the one hand items that are called abomination, and on the other hand things that are called most holy to the Lord. So the difficulty is, how do you translate that term with a word that incorporates the range of possible meanings from abomination to most holy? In other words, you have to see all of those elements as in some way consigned to the realm of the divine, therefore out of the purview of human misappropriation. That is to say, humans are not allowed the use of these items. Other suggested definitions include to devote to destruction, especially war booty or spoils, to dedicate something to Yahweh by the ban and thus rule out redemption. Now, more recent definitions have nuanced the term as consecration through destruction. This is where Philip Stern argues, and I'll talk about his work in a moment. Or the ritual destruction of enemy populations and their towns with consecration of these things to the deity. And this comes from Lauren Monroe, whose article about war herem traditions has helped to formulate my own thinking in this regard, and I'll talk about her contribution in a moment. So the cognate of this term, that is herem, it appears about 51 times in the Old Testament in its verbal form, that is to do herem, and 29 times in its nominal form, that is the noun herem that I've often referred to. Now, where does this occur first? It's first used in Exodus 22:20. And in this text, an idolater who sacrifices to a god other than Yahweh is to be placed under the herem. It might be instructive. Let's just turn there and look at that verse if you have your Bible. Exodus 22:20. This is the first reference of this term in the Old Testament canon. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be, as the ESV says, devoted to destruction, or consigned, as I would translate, to eradication. That is to say, they're to be placed under the herem. Now, what's significant about this? What's significant is, first of all, that herem is immediately linked to the sin of idolatry. So in its first appearance, it's linked to idolatry and presumably the pollution that false worship, idolatry, what I would say is ultimately demonic worship, entails. So herem is, I think, linked to sin that is so grievous, so heinous, that it's linked to demonic worship itself. Stern suggests that probably in this case, rather than simply applying the death penalty, the offender's property is proscribed, meaning all of the offender's property is to be put under the so-called ban or devoted to destruction. And this suggestion, I think, does play out in another text where this takes place, and that is Deuteronomy 13. In Deuteronomy 13, 13 to 18, an entire city is led away into idolatry, and the legislation there stipulates that the entire city is to be decimated of its inhabitants, and the building structures and spoils of the city are to be burned. So in that case, where Exodus 22 has an individual idolater, that is an entire city of idolatry, and in that case, the herem legislates the decimation of the human population and the burning of its structures and spoils. Now, when we reach Leviticus, we find perhaps a wrinkle in some of this terminology that causes us to dig a little deeper as to what's going on. In Leviticus, herem in its verbal and nominal forms is used to designate people, possessions, or fields that are devoted to Yahweh and therefore may not be sold or redeemed as belonging exclusively to the Lord. So for instance, if we look forward to turn forward to Leviticus 27, let me just point out a couple of these texts here. In verse 21, for instance, the field, when it is released in the Jubilee, shall be a holy gift to the Lord, like a field that has been devoted. That is to say, like a field of herem. The priest shall be in possession of it. We could go down and read verse 28. No devoted thing that a man devotes to the Lord of anything that he has, whether man or beast or of his inherited field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. So here we have one end of the spectrum, that which is the Lord's, therefore it may not be redeemed. It's designated as most holy. Now the difficulty arises when you move forward to Deuteronomy 7. And in Deuteronomy 7, 25 to 26, the herem is equated with abomination. I have here the text of that scripture. It says this: the idols of their gods you shall burn by fire. You shall not covet the silver or the gold that is on them and take it for yourselves, lest you get yourself entangled by it, for it is an abomination to the Lord your God. Now we know that abomination is the word that is used for the most extreme and the most grievous articles that are to be put away from God's people. Anything that is abomination is repugnant and repulsive to the Lord. You shall bring no abomination into your house, so that you may not likewise be a thing consigned to eradication. In other words, that you may not likewise be a herem, an item of herem. You shall utterly detest and loathe it, for it is consigned to eradication. So the difficulty here becomes, how do we deal with something that is most holy on the one end and an abomination on the other end? This seemingly all-destructive herem unites both poles together. So how do we do this? Stern says the way to understand this is herem removes abomination, creates holiness by designating it to the Lord. That is to say, the item is transferred to the domain of Yahweh, and therefore what might be abomination is now most holy. In the Joshua narratives, for instance, the herem is applied to several cities of Canaan. Now, the highest concentration of these cities imposed, that are imposed upon with herem, is the southern campaign around Jerusalem. Here there are 7 cities which are said in the narrative to be given over to herem. I list them for you there. And in these 7 cities, the narrative repeats in each case that they were devoted to destruction, or the herem. Now, without getting too much into this, there may be, I think, an argument to be made that this is something of a schematized summary. That is to say, we have 7 cities. 7 may be symbolic of what's going on. There are suggestions in the narrative that this is a summary because later we find out there were other cities that were destroyed in the southern campaign which aren't mentioned in this narrative in particular, such as Gedor, Hormah, Arad, and Adullam. Later portions suggest, for instance, Joshua 13:1, 15:63, 23:4 and 5, that much of the land is still to be conquered. We also have this instance where Caleb later has to retake Hebron, even though it appears in this list as having been devoted to destruction. So how do you deal with the potential discrepancy in the narrative there? Many would say that what's going on is over the course of the conquest, which takes 7 years, perhaps up to 5 years or 7, that it may be that Hebron is retaken by the Canaanites, and so Caleb has to retake it once again from them. In either case, there are 7 cities here that have the herem imposed upon them. Yet let me also point out there are only 3 cities in Canaan which appear to incorporate what I would say are all the typical elements of herem, which include capital punishment of the human population and destruction of the city by fire. Jericho, which is the most extreme case, Ai, and Hatzor. Perhaps these cities serve as a warning or exemplar to the people in the southern, central, and northern regions that Yahweh is claiming divine right over the land as a whole in order to bequeath it to his people. I'll make the case that when you impose herem, what you are saying is that God is claiming territorial rights over this land and over everything in it. Therefore, the judgment of the Lord has entered upon the land. Some use the phrase the intrusion of ethics, the idea that it's a momentary intrusion of an ethics that's outside of a normal course of human history. Stern proposes that the herem, as applied to Canaan, has reference both to chaos, destruction, and order, consecration. He defines it this way, that Yahweh's work with humanity is to bring order out of chaos by building the world through consecration. He says that it's a reenactment of creation by achieving world order, creating sacred space where Israel can live and thrive. I have a slide here of Philip Stern's view. Now, Philip Stern has come under a lot of criticism and controversy from some quarters. There are some that disagree with his thinking. But there are 2 works in particular more recently that I think have filled out some of the details that in my mind are very helpful for understanding what's going on with herem. So let me just briefly talk about this. One is a 9th century inscription by Mesha, king of Moab, who claims to have devoted to destruction the city of Nebo from Israel. There are only two clear accounts in the ancient Near East where this Semitic term herem is used in an inscription. Now, there are Akkadian synonyms and some other texts that seem to have the idea. There are only 2 texts that have this specific word used. One is the Mesha inscription. Let me just touch on this. He says, Chemosh said to me. Chemosh is the Moabite god. He commissions Mesha. Go take Nebo from Israel. I went in the night, I fought against it from the break of morning until noon, and I took it and killed all, 7,000 male citizens and foreign men. Notice he does use a round number here of 7,000. Female citizens, foreign women, and female slaves. He's looking at every facet of society. For Ashtar Chemosh, I made it, and here's the use of the word. This is from Bruce Routledge's translation, an inalienable possession through destruction. So he made this city for the purpose of the God, a city of herem. I took from there the vessels of Yahweh, I hauled them before Chemosh. I made this high place for Chemosh and Karho, a high place of salvation, because he saved me from all the kings and because he caused me to prevail over my enemies. Now, he goes on to describe the Moabite king here, how he goes on a building project after this, and he constructs Karho, which is likely the citadel or acropolis within the nearby city of Dibon, and he erects the walls of its urban park, its gates and towers, its retaining wall, its reservoirs, and he builds a high place. He builds an altar for Chemosh. Now, what's interesting is when you read carefully through the narrative of Joshua, you see similar elements, right? We have this pericope where the Israelites go and they enact a covenant ceremony. They build a place of worship. And so there are elements here that seem to draw from similar conceptions from the ancient Near East. So the king Mesha is binding himself in newly acquired territory to his god Chemosh through the purging work of Hiram and the reconstruction of its cities. Then the cities are repopulated with Moabite citizens. This is important because it helps us understand that it's not something where we're destroying a city just to destroy it, but it's asserting God's lordship, hegemony over these cities and then repopulating them with the new populace. There's one other inscription. This is an old South Arabian text from Sabah. And here, this has suffered from numerous mistranslations over the years. Monroe makes the case that this is Hiram, and I think she's right. It says this, "And he, King Kareb Ilu, devoted the city of Nashan to the Hiram by burning." And so Lauren Monroe, looking at this text, she says there are 4 elements that seem to always happen with Hiram if you compare these accounts. Number 1, a significant portion of the human population is killed as an act of capital punishment. Second, the city is destroyed, usually by fire. Third, the conquered territories are resettled by the victorious populace. And number 4, a cult installation is constructed, signifying the new God and his people have taken up residence in the land. So these are all important aspects of it. And from this, Monroe summarizes this. The harem presents itself as a political assertion of inviolable relationship between a conquered nation on its newly acquired land and the God for whom the land was granted. The purpose is not only to destroy an enemy. Okay, so it's important to see it's not a genocidal intent. It's positively linked to the binding of a new population to the land it has conquered. I think this fits well with our understanding, our proposal of holy war, that it's about the land and about the nation of Israel. By imposing harem on particular towns, the conquering population symbolically asserted political ascendancy over the land as a whole. In other words, by doing this, they're saying this land belongs to Yahweh. He's the new king. He's come in and he's claiming divine right to the land. All right, Routledge adds one other element that I think is important, and he says, when we find harem, we also find a prevention of exchange. And so he draws this concept, and essentially what he's saying is wherever there is harem, God steps in to separate exchange from happening. He says in every culture there are numerous types of exchange, whether it's social, economic, religious. Peoples interact with each other, right? This came to the fore when I used to live out in California. You could buy the food of any ethnicity under the sun in LA. Right? The fusion of cultures, as it said. So cultures do this. So harem is to prevent this exchange, and I think this is related to idolatry. If idolatry produces pollution, harem stops that pollution from spreading by preventing exchange. All right, let me go into one more aspect, and then we'll pick up on this when we come back, and that is this. I have not seen other people do this, but I think we also need to understand that harem, I think, echoes the Genesis flood. That is to say, when Israel comes into the land, we are, I think, meant to see echoes here of the Genesis flood. In recent scholarship, the Genesis flood has been highlighted as a divine act of judgment that purged the world from the pollution of wickedness, particularly violence, and cleansed its habitations for a nucleus of new humanity. And Noah is often is depicted, I think, in the narrative as a new Adam who comes and is to repopulate the earth. Now, there are lots we could talk about related to that. I'm just proposing that as a way of reading this. And what's interesting is there are several connections, I think, between the flood account and harem as it's imposed upon Canaan. For instance, here are a few of them. Number 1, the term blot out, a Hebrew word macha, describes those who perish in the flood in Genesis 7:4 and verse 23, as well as the Amalekites whom God intends to macha, to blot out as he wages war against them. I think the Amalekites are a special case in some instance because God wages a prototypical Yahweh war against them. And so he desires to blot out this people in reference to as the flood does. Now, Saul is supposed to do this. He's supposed to finish this task in 1 Samuel 15. The term harem is used 8 times in 1 Samuel 15 as a suggestion here that Saul is supposed to finish the work. Number 2, the earth was corrupt prior to the flood, and Moses warns the people of Israel not to corrupt themselves with idolatry for the sake of the land they are about to possess. So the implication here is if they corrupt themselves with the pollution of idolatry and sexual perversion, that they too will need to be dispossessed from the land, so they are not to corrupt themselves. Third, the waters of the flood prevailed over the earth, and that same term is used, gavar, to describe how Israel prevails over Amalek in the Yahweh war when Moses raises his hands. You remember that account from Exodus 17? He has his assistants who help him keep his hands up. Next, everything that has breath perishes in the flood. And it's interesting, in Deuteronomy 20, this is repeated, that they are to save alive nothing that has breath, a command that Joshua obeys in Joshua 10 and 11. All flesh was cut off by the waters of the flood, and Joshua in Joshua 11 is said to cut off the Anakim from the land of Canaan. And then lastly, the narrative of Noah's cursing of Canaan, I think interestingly, for his sexual perversion, immediately follows the family's exit from the ark. If you read this account in Genesis 9, we often skip this, and I often relate this in church context. When you're reading the Bible, sometimes you miss some of these important details that become integral parts of the story later on. And this is one of them. In this incident, Canaan is cursed. And it's interesting that Canaan as the son of Ham is cursed, right, rather than Ham. And what is he cursed for? Some sort of sexual perversion related to illicit exposure of nakedness. And if you follow that theme throughout the storyline of the Old Testament, again and again, that's linked to the Canaanite people. As in some way they are extreme purveyors of sexual perversion through illicit forms of nakedness. And so I think that curse that's pronounced upon Canaan foreshadows the role of Israel, who fulfills this curse on Canaan as just retribution for its sexual perversion. And so in light of this, I would suggest Israel's imposition of harem upon select cities of Canaan functions as a recapitulation of the flood account, signaling God is removing pollution, establishing new humanity in the purified habitations of the land.